Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the first in our series of lectures on the Torah's view on hot issues. This week, we're going to be talking about the idea of art and the artist. And tonight's lecture is entitled, Doth the Composer Treif the Music Make? And the source of tonight's lecture is based on a new book that has come out on Wagner. The name of the book is Wagnerism: Art and Politics in the Shadow of Music. Now, it's a book by Alex Ross, who is the musical critic at The New Yorker. Now, Ross himself doesn't believe that Wagner's work is inherently anti-Semitic, but no doubt, apart from his music that he made, he also authored a number of clearly anti-Semitic works, such as Das Judentum in der Musik, Jewishness in Music, and his son-in-law, Houston Stuart Chamberlain, originally British, eventually a German philosopher, who married Wagner's daughter Eva, presented himself to Hitler and said that Hitler embodied Parsifal, which was Wagner's last opera, which was loosely based on Parzival by Wolfram von Ischenbach, which was a 13th century epic poem of the Arthurian knight Parzival and his quest for the Holy Grail. And he said, that was Hitler, and Hitler, liked that idea. So certainly his son-in-law was a big supporter of Nazism, but Ross would like to suggest in his book that the jury is still out on Wagner. Now, the reputation that Wagner gets as a Nazi was the notion that he was loved by Nazis. Two movies, one came out in 1939, I think the other one 1940. One was called Confessions of a Nazi Spy. The other one was called Escape. There's also this mythology around Wagner being piped through the loudspeakers in the death camps. Now, Primo Levi says that it wasn't, he never heard Wagner, he heard polkas that were being belted out. But then this Wagner idea of extermination, annihilation has been continued through Hollywood. In Apocalypse Now, you have the American helicopter going through, obliterating the Vietnamese village to the tune of the Ride of the Valkyries. Now, Ross says in his book that, and he brings all sorts of proofs that the Wagner wasn't necessarily anti-Semitic himself. He says that Theodor Herzl enjoyed attending Wagner's operas. And he says that in addition to that, Wagner surrounded himself with many Jewish friends, even allowing them to conduct his operas. So the fact is, the reputation still remains. And if you go to Israel, Wagner is not played on the radio. Now, it's not illegal to play Wagner on the radio. It's just it's taboo. Public opinion says that we don't listen to Wagner. So my question I want to pose this evening is, despite Alex Ross's book trying to in some way exonerate Wagner, certainly he says that Wagnerism has led to anti-Semitism and the politics of Wagnerism. But is it okay to listen to Wagner? Anti-Semitic or not anti-Semitic, is it okay to listen to Wagner? Certainly the music itself is not the man. Now, at the same time, I realize that not all of the audience this evening is high culture, so I want to throw another couple of names into the mix, just so that you know that this is really a topic that covers the gamut. Think about Michael Jackson. Michael Jackson, pop culture, right? One of the greatest pop culture musicians, artists of all time, and yet Michael Jackson, especially the movie that came out, the documentary that came out last year, Escape to Neverland, seems to suggest that he had some serious shortcomings and maybe even some criminal issues going on there with pedophilia. We don't know. He was never stood to trial, but seems to be those that would like to claim that. So if that's true, is Michael Jackson taboo? Let's move to the Jewish realm, because there are those of you who are listening saying, well, I don't listen to non-Jewish music or Jewish music. How about Rabbi Shlomo Carlebach? Rabbi Shlomo Carlebach, again, very difficult to judge some of these characters posthumously. Lilith magazine a number of years ago published a number of allegations against Rabbi Shlomo Carlebach. And when it came up again as an issue just a couple of years ago, a number of shuls decided that they would no longer sing Carlebach tunes in their shul, either because they felt that this was indeed, there was substance allegations, or for many, even just the notion of it being a trigger that certain people would walk out, it just wasn't worth it. So, but on a personal basis, at least, if it is true, again, we're not assuming that any of these allegations are true, is it permissible to listen to these artists knowing that maybe they weren't completely wholesome human individuals, human beings? So no doubt this is an emotional issue, and certainly in Israel, huge Holocaust survivors, this is a big deal. So, but I want to talk for a moment, try and separate the emotion from the rational. Be able to say rationally, logically, and halachically, is there a problem listening to these forms of music in light of who composed them and who sang them? In other words, the actual line is, can we separate the artist from the art, or the art from the artist? So let's begin with the scholarship on this idea of separating the art from the artist. So until the end of the 19th century, this was never an issue. Nobody ever thought about it being two separate entities, art and artist. Art was part of the artist, was a representation of the artist, symbolized the artists themselves. Early 20th century, you now had what was called at the time the new critics. And the new critics said, no, once the art has been depicted, whether that be art in the form of artwork or music or however it is, the art should be analyzed on its own merits, completely separate from the author of that art. So this is new criticism. So let me give you, for example, a quote from T.S. Eliot in 1923, who says, I've assumed as axiomatic that a creation, a work of art, is autonomous. So the new way of thinking in the early 20th century from the new critics was that art was like science. Art is completely separate. When a scientist makes a product, then we separate it out. So for example, let's say a pedophile invented the vaccine for COVID-19, or invented the cure for COVID-19. Would you say, well, it was made by a pedophile, I'm not going to go near there? Most people wouldn't. Most people say, well, it's a vaccine, it's science, they made it. So the scientist happens to be a flawed individual. It doesn't matter. It's a scientific object that's separate from the scientists themselves, and we should accept it and use it. So in the new criticism of art of the early 20th century, the same attitude was taken to art as science. Once it's separate from the composer, from the inventor, now it is to be considered on its own merit. Moving along to the late 1960s, we have the beginning of the postmodern era. And the postmodernists looked at art and said, well, it's not that the art is separate on its own. It's that the art itself, the artist is dead. Whether the artist is really dead or not really dead, alive or dead or alive, the artist is dead vis-a-vis the artwork, because the artwork should be judged not in relation to the artist, but in relation to me, the one who is engaging with it. I become, by the way I engage with the art or the music, a co-creator. The way that I view it through my personal lens, I am now the artist. So whoever began the story is not relevant to the conversation. I am now the artist. I'm the one engaging with it. So let me give you an idea from Roland Barthes, who said that the author doesn't create a text. The reader does just by reading. Every time readers encounter a text, they remake it anew, and in a way the author has no control over, which means the text has no stable, definitive, final interpretation. All it is the way I perceive it. If that's the case, then whoever started it shouldn't be relevant to the conversation. Finally, beginning towards the end of the 20th century, 1990s, you have the new historicists who said no such thing. Every time you examine art, it has to be in the context of the artist and the society and time in which he or she lived. And that's the only way to be able to understand the art and music that you are engaging with. And so different approaches, different times. What does Judaism, what does the Torah say about separating the art from the artist? Okay, let's go to our source sheets. The source sheets I have posted both on the Facebook page and in the social WhatsApp group and in the Shiurim WhatsApp group. There should be a link to a blog spot. Okay, first of all, we're going to look at the Gemara in Yuma. Says the Talmud, Al Rishon Nema, concerning the first one that says, Zecher Tzadik Livracha. There's a verse in Proverbs that says that the remembrance of the righteous is for a blessing. Meaning to say that if you mention someone who is righteous, that in itself engenders blessing in your life by bringing the memory of a good person in your life, right? So that's why we talk about somebody who has passed on. We say Zichrona Livracha, may her memory be a blessing, or Zecher Tzadik Livracha, may this righteous person's memory be a blessing. The flip side of that is Valbem comes with a Chavera of Nemar, also in Mishlei, in Proverbs, in the same verse, it says, V'shem Rishayim Yirkav, and the name of the wicked should decay. Demai. My V'shem Rishayim Yirkav, what's the meaning of the second part of the verse? Amar Rebbe Elazar, Rak Vivas Talib B'shmosam D'loi Maskinan B'shmaihu. May decay come into their name, that we should never have any discussions about their name. Simply even mentioning their names, that gives life to the name, that makes their name have some sort of long-term memory, and we want to eradicate their name. So from here, it would seem that if somebody is a bad individual, we want to avoid any situation where we might give them any credit, any merit, and that seems to speak to our discussion here. By listening to Wagner, by listening to Michael Jackson, by listening perhaps to Shlomo Carlebach, that is making their memory and their legacy endure. And if it's true that they are flawed individuals or worse, then that's something that we want to avoid. Sure enough, so let's talk practically speaking. Rabbi Menashe Klein, who was a contemporary halachic authority, he actually survived Auschwitz. He was a rabbi in Czechoslovakia, known as the Ungvara Rav. Rav later became a Hasidic Rebbe in Williamsburg, and finally, the last few years of his life in Israel, last number of years, where he authored many, many books of halacha and other works of Torah. So his halachic works are known as the Mishnah Halachas, and he says like this. He says, is it permissible, he was asked, to listen to cassettes, recordings of soulful music, from a composer who went astray religiously? It's simple. It's forbidden to listen to the work of a wicked man, or min, or apokoros, or a heretic. Even if a heretic were to write a Torah scroll, we would burn that Torah. Right? The Torah that we can't even allow to drop. No, if it's written by a wicked person, that Torah itself becomes off limits, and it's considered a bad piece of art. How much more so we shouldn't learn from that Torah. And certainly we wouldn't listen to the tunes of such a composer. We wouldn't want to attach any form of evil to righteous people. What about, do we make a distinction between recordings that they made while they were still okay and afterwards when they went astray and started engaging in improper behavior? He says, Yidum Shem Shalom Nagin Vadei de Asal Shaman Dalidei Maskirin Shem Ra. He says it doesn't make a difference. By listening to them, we are giving them a legacy, and we don't want to mention their name. The Gemara has told us in Yuma, we don't mention their name, we don't bring up their memory, we don't give them a legacy. It doesn't matter that they made this legacy, they made these compositions when they were still okay. That's besides the point. Now that they eventually went bad, we no longer acknowledge any of their prior works either. Let's continue. Says the Gemara in Sota. So we're going to bring two examples. So that's the position of Rabbi Menashe Klein. What we're going to do now is we're going to see some of the sources that would disagree with him in our classic traditional texts. And then eventually we're going to see the opinion of Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, who differs with Rabbi Klein and says that it would be permissible. So let's look at those sources and let's understand why Rabbi Feinstein would separate the art from the artist. First, we look at the Gemara in Sota on page 48b. So we're on our first page still. Says the Gemara, talking about Yochanan Kohen Gadol. So Yochanan Kohen Gadol was a Kohen Gadol. He was the high priest who was a righteous man for 80 years. Now, some say that he was the father of Matityahu. Matityahu, not as in the reggae singer, but as in the hero of Hanukkah. We read in the Alanissim, Bimei Matityahu ben Yochanan Kohen Gadol. In the days of Matityahu, the son of Yochanan the high priest. And so that Yochanan may have been, could have been a great-grandson, but that may have been, either way, there was a high priest who was a righteous man for 80 years and then eventually became a Sadducee, eventually left the way of Torah and mitzvahs, of observance. So, but listen to this. He had certain things, institutions, decrees, laws that he set in place when he was on the straight and narrow. And the Gemara here says that those laws remain in effect. We don't say, well, he must have been bad, rotten apple all along, and so we're now going to annul all of those decrees. No, the case that we're talking about here in particular is a case of produce. Yochanan, the high priest, saw the people weren't tithing their produce properly, and so he says, you know what? Here on in, anytime you buy produce, agricultural produce, from an unlearned person, somebody who's not particularly well versed in the laws, you have to separate the tithes. You can't assume that they've already separated the tithes. You have to do it yourself, even though you're not the farmer. And so that decree, that enactment, remains in effect even after we know that Yochanan has left the good path, the straight and narrow. So that's what the Gemara there says in Sota. So again, very important to see that here's a fellow that is no longer kosher, and yet we still adhere to his enactments. Let's see the Gemara where he goes off the straight and narrow. It says the Gemara in Brachas we're on page 2 now, Brachas 29a. Al tamin ba'atzmacha ad yom moscha, says the Gemara, don't believe in yourself until the day of your death. I don't think, I've done everything right until now. I've brought up a wonderful family, children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren. I'm on the home stretch now, and everything's fine and dandy. I don't have to make any effort in my religiosity. I can just go with the flow. No, you always have to be in tune with your spirituality. Why? For Yochanan, the high priest, he served as high priest for 80 years, and in the end, he became a Sadducee. Right? Nobody should ever rest on their laurels. But from this Gemara, we see that he went off, and nevertheless, in the previous Gemara, we see that we still acknowledge his enactments when he was good. let's see another example of that. And I want to switch the order because I think the moving the order around. Actually, let's stay with this order. This order makes the most sense. The other example we have is a fella by the name of Elisha ben Avuya. Elisha ben Avuya as well. Great rabbi, one of our greatest rabbis from the Mishnaic period, and eventually he leaves his Jewish practice. He stops observing. So let's see the Gemara here. It's a bit of a long Gemara, but I've brought for you both the original Aramaic and the English. We're on pages 2 and 3. Says the Gemara, Acher kitzes bentius, alav of Omer, al titin pichal lachti pesarcha. So Acher, he was known as Acher, the other one. And we'll see why in a moment, why he was called the other one. So he chopped down the saplings. In other words, he didn't behave as he should have. How did that all come to pass? So what happened, we know there's another story where 4 great sages entered the orchard of Kabbalah. Right? They start to look into the esoteric parts of the Torah. Only Rabbi Akiva enters and exits b'shalom and peace. Elisha ben Avuya was one of those 4 rabbis. And after he had entered the orchard of Kabbalah, he comes out and he just leaves it all. What was it? What was it that he'd seen inside the spiritual orchard that made him have heretical thoughts? So he's seeing Metatron, who is one of the great angels, sitting there in front of God. He's writing the merits of Israel. It seems like he's the one doing the judgment. He says, I thought there's only one God, and God is in control of all of the merits and all of the prosecutions. Who's this other angel that's doing things? Maybe there are 2 gods. Maybe we have a binary or a Zoroastrian system where there are 2 opposing forces, one of good and one of evil. At that point, my time resisted like come to Makame. Okay, so at that point they say to Metatron, you should have stood up when Elisha ben Avuya came to look at what was going on. He assumed that you're there sitting as an equal to God. Now, henceforth, we never want that to happen again, and you're deposed from your position. Meanwhile, still Elisha ben Avuya is sitting there, is still receiving this revelation, and he hears the verse from Jeremiah being declared, Shuvu banim shovavim, all of my children, please repent, please return, says God. Chutz ma'acher, except for Elisha ben Avuya. You're the only one that is beyond all hope. You can't repent. Amar said, you know what? Elisha ben Avuya says to himself, you know what? If that's the case, hoil v'itra gaver me'ahu alma, leipuk me'ahu alma, leipuk l'sana b'hai alma nafak. He says, if I'm anyway beyond hope, then at least let me enjoy this world. And so he then goes off the derech. He then no longer is observant, and he goes to enjoy himself, enjoy all the pleasures of this world. Nafak ashkach zona, found himself a harlot, tava, and he propositioned her. Amrale said to her, she said to him, Valav Elisha ben Avuya, aren't you the great rabbi Elisha ben Avuya? Aka pugla memishra b'shabbos v'yavla amra v'yavla. So he uproots some mushrooms from the ground and gives it to her on Shabbos. And she's like, oh, right, that's a little strange. He's like, I'm no longer observant. Amra, she says, Acheru, this guy is another one, his other. Right, so henceforth he got the nickname Acher, the other one. He was no longer known as Rabbi Elisha ben Avuya. Right, so here we have an example of somebody who goes off, and we're going to see soon that despite the fact that he goes off, we're still going to abide by his decisions and learn his teachings. What's more, let's see in the continuation of the Gemara here, we have a notion where even his own student Rabbi Meir is able to make that distinction between the art the artist and the art. So what happens? Eventually he dies. Bitul shel Acher astil kamed Rebbe. The daughter of Acher, after he died, comes before Rebbe. Amra le Rebbe Parnaseni. She says, Rebbe, I need some sort of sustenance. Amar la basmiat. He says, who are you? Amra lo bitul shel Acher ani. She says, well, I'm Acher's daughter. Amar lo says to Adain yesh mizar ba'olam. Does he still have offspring? That somebody so wicked shouldn't have any remembrance, any legacy whatsoever in this world. Amr Allah, she said to him, remember his Torah, his art, his science, his art. Don't think about him, the person, his deeds. Think about what he contributed as a rabbi, as a great rabbi. Suddenly a fire comes down and burns, singes the seat of Rebbe. Bacha, he cried. Amar, and he said, Amar Rebbe, and Rebbe said, if this is the way the Almighty or heaven treats someone who had disdain for the Torah, how much more so someone who honors the Torah, praises the Torah, that they will be treated well and honored by heaven. But Reb Meir, who was the student of Acher, how did he continue to treat him as his Torah teacher even after Acher had left the ways of Torah? What's the meaning of the verse in Malachi? For the lips of the priest will guard knowledge. And Torah they shall seek from his mouth, for he is an angel of the Lord of hosts. So the meaning is, if your rabbi is like an angel of God, then he's a good rabbi. You should seek Torah from him. But if not, don't go to him for Torah. So how could Rabbi Meir use Acher as his Torah teacher? Amar Reish Lakish says, Rameir Kra Ashkach Vadar. She had a different verse that he expounded. Hat Oznacha Ushma Direch Chamim. Put your ear, listen, turn your ear and listen to the words of the sages. V'libcha tashis ladati, and your heart will turn to my knowledge, says God. Ladat Tomlo. Now it doesn't say to their knowledge, knowledge of the sages. Ela ladati, but to my knowledge, says God. And so Rabbi Meir says, I'm not listening to Acher because it's his knowledge. I'm listening because it's God's knowledge, and he is the one, he knows the Torah better than anybody else. So it doesn't matter that he's no longer religious, he's no longer observant. If he's the one who's the expert in Torah, he's the one that I need to seek counsel from, learn from, seek wisdom from. And in fact, not only does Rabbi Meir, but we all learn, at least on an annual basis, from Elisha ben Avuya in Pirkei Avot. We're all familiar with this Mishnah. On page 4, Pirkei Avot 420, Elisha ben Avuya, one who learns as a child, to what may he be compared? To new writing on new parchment. One who learns as an adult or later in years, what's he compared to? To writing on smudged paper, on wiped out paper. It's not so clear anymore. All of the paper's been written, all of the experiences you've had in life, and then you're taking all of the new knowledge you have and viewing it through the lens of whatever experiences and wisdom you've had in the past, some of which may be good, some of which may be not necessarily so great. And so it's not the best way to learn. The best way to learn is to pack it into when we're children. And so this teaching, fabulous teaching that lasts for all eternity, but who gave that teaching? Acher, who was a wicked man. So it seems from these sources that we can separate the art from the artist. We can learn Torah from Yochanan Kohen Gadol, from Acher, Elisha ben Avuya. It may be true that they became wicked, but the Torah that they taught when they were righteous, we honor that and we honor them for that. All right, let's look into some other examples. Says the Shulchan Aruch, Sefer Torah shekosboi apikaris yisarif. A Torah scroll, we saw this from Rabbi Klein, a Torah scroll that was written by a heretic should be burnt. All right, we're so worried about the Sefer Torah dropping. Yeah, a Torah scroll written by a heretic should be burned. It is just like the heretic is wicked, the Torah scroll itself has no value. Not only has it no value, it should be destroyed. All right, so that seems to be cut and dry. We don't separate the art from the artist. Nevertheless, listen to what the Piskei Tshuva says. Ach b'tshuva zagon bal noda b'Yehuda. So he's quoting Rabbi Yecheskel Landau in the 18th century, who says that if at the time that he was writing this Torah, he wasn't yet a wicked person, he may have even been a little suspect, nevertheless, we're still not sure that he was wicked at the time. If that's the case, we don't burn the Torah. We treat it with holiness. We, if need be, I mean, we bury it. Maybe we shouldn't use it because it's a little suspicious, but we treat it with reverence and we bury it. And so what we see here in this, Rabbi Moshe Feinstein points out that we do find a distinction between what the artist engaged in during his religious period and subsequent to his religious period. If it was during his religious period, then whatever he composed is considered acceptable. So if, for example, if it's true, again, these are all allegations that we're not assuming, but just use the example, and may I be forgiven if it's, if the allegations are not true, and I don't mean to speak ill of the dead, but just to use the example that is quoted in the Lil's magazine, if Rabbi Kalbach's compositions were made during the time that he was above all suspicion, then they would be completely acceptable, says Rabbi Feinstein, based on this Noda B'Yehuda here, who says that we treat the person as righteous and their compositions as righteous during their righteous period. What happens afterwards is dichotomized and that's separated, and so those compositions might be problematic, just like that Torah would be burned. Having said that, Rabbi Feinstein wants to take it a step further. Rabbi Feinstein would say that even the compositions that take place when the person is wicked, Rabbi Feinstein says it still is not in the same category as the Sefer Torah. Why? Let's see what he says. The truth is, even after his reputation was sullied, I'm not so sure that you can't listen to his nigunim, to his tunes. As long as we're talking about kosher tunes that are not inappropriate tunes themselves. Your concern about giving a legacy to the wicked, it's only true of holy items that a heretic composed. That's going to give them a holy legacy. But if it's just a song, a tune, then it's not so clear that they would be prohibited. Mundane matters, there's no significance, but that they have their name that now endures through their music. Vein lesser, he says it's not prohibited to listen to these compositions. Just like we wouldn't say, so here's back to our original question, if a pedophile invented the vaccine for COVID-19, according to Rav Moshe, it's science. We wouldn't say, well, it's off limits. We can't separate the science from the scientist. No, we would say it's completely separate from the person that invented it. And he says the same thing would apply to the art. You can separate the art from the artist. Almost we see, only when it comes to matters of holiness, like a Sefer Torah, that would be a disgrace to give a legacy, a name for a heretic, for the wicked. But when it comes to mundane matters, Rav Moshe says it would be okay. So the conclusion of this shir. So again, we have Rabbi Klein that says you can never support, you can never give a legacy to someone who is wicked. And Rabbi Klein would say no listening to any compositions by Wagner or by anyone who has a bad name. We want to be able to obliterate their name from history. And anytime that we support their art, we're continuing their life in this world. Rav Moshe Feinstein disagrees. He says, based on the sources, that the only time we're concerned about giving their legacy life is when it comes to holy matters, such as writing a Sefer Torah, a Sefer Torah that was written by a heretic. But when it comes to mundane matters, we're not concerned in the same way that we would allow for the science of a somebody who was not a good person. We would also allow for their art. There's nothing forbidden about it, but certainly, again, one should always be concerned for the emotions and for the feelings of those around us, even though it might not bother you to listen to Wagner or to listen to Michael Jackson or to listen to Shlomo Carlebach. You have to think about the feelings of others who may have personal issues or just general issues that they may feel this is appropriate. So that's what Rav Moshe would say. Thank you all for joining this evening. Wishing everybody well, and looking forward to the shir again next week. All the very best. Have a good night, everyone.